I was never the type to believe in ghosts or curses. I didn't buy into all the talk about haunted places or paranormal activity. But then there's something about the rush of urban exploring, about stepping into a world that's been forgotten by everyone else. The silence that swallows you when you enter a place abandoned for decades, where no one has dared to walk for years. And in that silence, you feel something. Something that gnaws at the back of your mind, making you wonder if, maybe, just maybe, you're not as alone as you think. If you like this kind of adrenaline-fueled exploration, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. I'm Jake, and today I'm taking you on a journey through the most infamous abandoned prison in the country. Stick around, this one's going to be a wild ride. Jake had always been drawn to the thrill, the kind of person who found beauty in what others saw as decay. Where some saw rusted doors and peeling paint, Jake saw stories waiting to be uncovered. He'd spent years wandering through the forgotten corners of cities, filming the remnants of lives once lived. For him, it wasn't about the places themselves, but the rush of stepping into a space left behind, untouched by time. The idea that for a brief moment he could occupy a space where history had been left to rot. But Jake wasn't the kind of person who did things halfway. He wasn't content with just wandering through abandoned houses or old factories. He needed more. That's why he'd built his entire YouTube channel on it. An endless search for new places that no one else dared to visit. He didn't just want to explore, he wanted to document. His audience lived for the thrill of it too, tuning in to watch as he ventured deeper into crumbling institutions, posting every twist and turn along the way. And Jake had become somewhat of a legend in the urban exploration community. There were plenty of people who did what he did, of course. Explorers who loved to delve into forgotten spaces. But Jake took it further. He was a self-made professional in the world of abandoned buildings, a YouTuber with a growing following. He'd built a brand on being fearless, on doing what no one else would, filming the impossible and posting it for all to see. For years, his channel had been growing steadily, his content attracting more and more attention with every daring adventure he took. He knew the risks. He'd faced danger before. But he didn't care. The thrill was always worth it. He wasn't one for small, easy projects. He had explored everything from abandoned hospitals to forgotten amusement parks, each time pushing the limits just a little further. But now he was setting his sights on something bigger. Something that made even the seasoned explorers in his circle hesitate. The prison. The name alone sent a shiver down his spine. It was notorious for being one of the most haunted places in the country, a place where countless rumors had swirled about strange happenings and ghostly apparitions. Built at the turn of the 20th century, it had housed some of the country's most dangerous criminals, men who had lived their lives in the shadows of steel bars and stone walls. Stories said the spirits of the inmates still roamed its halls, trapped in the prison even after death. But Jake wasn't fazed by the talk. Ghosts, spirits, curses, they didn't matter to him. He was after something else. This prison, with its history and reputation, was going to be his biggest challenge yet. The ultimate test. He'd heard all the warnings, of course. Stories from other explorers who had ventured in and never returned. The odd noises, the flickering lights, the feeling of being watched. They were all just part of the legend. The prison was an enigma, a place that had been sealed off for years. And Jake wanted to break it open. He wanted to prove that no place was off limits. No place was too dangerous. The prison sat just outside the city, surrounded by overgrown trees and a tall, crumbling stone wall. From a distance, it looked like a hulking, broken beast, its windows dark and its walls cracked with age. The stories of what had happened inside were more than enough to make anyone wary. But Jake wasn't just anyone. He wasn't afraid of a little history, no matter how twisted it might be. Jake had spent the last few weeks gathering intel, piecing together maps, old photos, and blueprints of the prison. He wanted to know every inch of it before he set foot inside. This wasn't like other explorations. He needed to be prepared. The last thing he wanted was to get trapped or caught. He'd read all the stories, seen the old photographs, and watched videos of other explorers who had gone in and never made it out. But he never thought that could be him. He wasn't alone, though. He had his camera, his best companion, always at his side. His channel's audience depended on the footage, and Jake knew that. He had to film everything. Every step, every hallway, every decaying room. The prison had a history that demanded to be seen. Jake's plan was simple: get in, document, and get out. The prison was notorious for being massive. 3 main buildings connected by long, narrow hallways, each one more haunting than the last. The prisoners who had been held there were known for their violence and ruthlessness, and rumors about the horrors they had endured still lingered. But for Jake, those were just stories. He wasn't interested in the past. He was interested in what lay waiting for him in the present. He made his way through the overgrown path that led to the main entrance, the massive iron gates creaking in protest as he pushed them open. A chill ran down his spine, but it was the same chill he always felt when entering a new forbidden space. The thrill of the unknown. The rush of stepping into something forgotten, left behind by everyone else. The inside was a maze of rusting metal and cracked stone. The air was thick, carrying with it a heavy scent of mildew and decay. The floors creaked beneath his feet, and the walls seemed to hum with the weight of a past that refused to stay silent. Every corner was filled with the remnants of lives that had been lost, forgotten. The prison wasn't just abandoned, it was dead. Every cell block, every hallway, every broken window felt like a testament to the lives that had once filled the space. As he moved deeper into the heart of the prison, his footsteps echoed louder, the silence around him pressing in like a living thing. Jake paused for a moment, surveying the scene. He could feel it now, the faint sense that he wasn't alone. But he didn't let it distract him. He raised the camera, capturing every detail, making sure he documented everything. The truth was, he wasn't sure if he was afraid, or if it was just the excitement of the unknown pushing him forward. But then, something changed. It started as a faint sound, a rustling somewhere in the distance, but Jake wasn't sure where it came from. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. He knew it wasn't the wind. The air in the prison was still, too still. And for the first time, Jake felt a prickle of doubt. Was he really alone? Shaking it off, he continued, determined to finish what he'd started. He wasn't going to be scared off by noises in the dark. But as he turned a corner, he caught something in his peripheral vision. A shadow? No, it was gone too quickly. But it was enough to make his heart skip. Jake quickly glanced around, but there was nothing. Nothing but the emptiness that stretched out before him. He swallowed hard. Something was off. And he had no idea just how much danger he was about to walk into. Jake had always prided himself on his ability to shake off the eerie feelings that crept up on him during his urban explorations. But this time, something was different. He had felt it as soon as he stepped into the prison. The air, thick with decay, felt too heavy. The silence, almost suffocating. The rustling sound he had heard, the one that made his heart race, was just the beginning. He pushed it out of his mind, telling himself it was just the wind or the old building settling. But the unease never truly left. He wasn't sure why, but something told him that this place wasn't like the others. Jake kept moving forward, his camera fixed on the hallways that stretched endlessly before him. The prison felt vast, too vast, and every step he took seemed to take him deeper into its suffocating grip. His flashlight cut through the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. The sound of his own footsteps echoed around him, too loud, too obvious. But then, just as before, there was that faint rustling again, like something was moving just out of sight, following him. Jake paused, his breath shallow, his heart quickening. He looked over his shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty halls of the prison, the crumbling walls, and the eerie silence that seemed to swallow everything. He shook his head, forcing himself to breathe normally. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. But it wasn't the first time he had felt this way. He had explored places that were abandoned and decayed, places with their own stories and histories, but never had he felt this kind of presence. This wasn't just an old building. It was as if something was watching him, waiting for him to make a wrong move. The thought made him uneasy, but he ignored it. He had a job to do. He wasn't about to let fear stop him now. Jake continued to move deeper into the prison. The walls closed in on him, the corridors narrowing, turning into a maze. Each corner he rounded felt like a new challenge. The place seemed to stretch on endlessly, and yet there was something about it that made Jake feel like he wasn't making any progress at all. The air grew colder as he walked, his breath coming out in shallow puffs, visible in the flashlight's beam. The temperature, once stagnant, now seemed to shift, becoming colder with every step. But it wasn't just the temperature that was changing. The atmosphere felt different too. It was as if the very walls of the prison were alive, breathing, moving around him. The shadows, dark and oppressive, seemed to follow him wherever he went. They stretched and shifted, swirling in the corners of his vision, as if trying to keep pace with him. And with each step, the rustling grew louder, closer. He could feel it now, more than just a passing breeze or the sound of the building settling. Something, or someone, was definitely moving in the shadows. Then, the flashlight flickered. The beam of light stuttered and buzzed, and for a moment, the room was plunged into total darkness. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He fumbled for a second, his fingers searching for the spare batteries in his bag. His pulse raced, and the silence seemed to stretch on forever. The flashlight flickered again, sputtering and dimming before it finally steadied, casting a shaky light across the room. He exhaled, relief washing over him, but the unease lingered. Jake kept moving, trying to shake off the fear that was crawling up his spine. The camera was still running, capturing every inch of the prison. His audience would want to see everything. They'd want to see the shadows, the cracked walls, the forgotten corners. But more than that, he wanted to capture the essence of the place. The feeling of being trapped inside something ancient, something that had outlived its purpose. But then, as he turned another corner, his footsteps faltered. He saw something. It wasn't much, just a flash of movement in the corner of his eye. But it was enough to make him stop dead in his tracks. He spun around, raising the flashlight in the direction of the movement. But there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. The shadows were still. The air was thick and cold. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, just out of his sight. He moved forward again, slowly this time, his heart pounding louder than his footsteps. He couldn't deny it any longer. There was something here. Something that didn't belong. The rustling had stopped, but the feeling of being watched had only intensified. He kept his camera trained ahead of him, trying to capture everything in front of him, trying to stay focused on the task at hand. The prison seemed to stretch on forever, a labyrinth of dark, empty rooms and long, narrow corridors. The walls, covered in peeling paint and grime, seemed to close in on him as he walked, the space feeling smaller, tighter. It was as if the prison was alive, shifting, watching. He turned another corner, and then suddenly, the room opened up into a larger space. A prison yard, long abandoned, overgrown with weeds and brambles. Jake stepped into the yard, taking in the desolation. Broken fences, shattered windows, the remnants of a once vibrant place now reduced to rubble. He raised the camera, documenting every detail, trying to capture the history of the space. He needed the footage. His channel depended on it. But as he stood there, the unease crept up again. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. And then, just as he began to think he was losing his mind, it happened again. A noise, sharp, sudden, echoed from somewhere behind him. Jake spun around, his heart racing, the camera swinging wildly in his grip. But there was nothing there. Just the empty yard, the dilapidated buildings, the rusting fences. He took a shaky breath, trying to steady himself. It was just the wind, just the old building settling. But the longer he stood there, the more the doubt crept in. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Something was moving just out of sight, always just a few steps behind. He turned to leave the yard, but then he heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and unmistakable. The sound of someone, or something, walking in the shadows. Jake froze, his breath catching in his throat. He couldn't be hearing things. It had to be the wind, or maybe another explorer. But he hadn't seen anyone else enter the prison. He was alone, wasn't he? He took a cautious step forward, his pulse pounding in his ears. The footsteps stopped. Jake's heart raced. He couldn't stand still. He had to move. He started walking quickly, then running, the sound of his own footsteps drowning out everything else. He moved through the hallways in a blur, caught the camera still rolling, capturing the disorienting scene, but his mind was elsewhere. He needed to get out. He needed to get away. But the footsteps followed him. They were getting closer now, echoing in the dark, bouncing off the walls of the narrow hallway. He could feel them behind him, the sound too distinct to ignore. Every time he turned a corner, they were there. Every time he slowed, they slowed with him. And then, the worst part, the part that would haunt him for the rest of his life, he heard a whisper. It was so soft, so faint, that he almost thought it was his imagination. But then, it came again, clearer this time. Jake. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the building settling. The voice was real, and it was calling his name. His heart nearly stopped. He whipped around, raising the flashlight again, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. Empty, except for the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if reaching for him. He stumbled back, his hands trembling as he gripped the camera tighter. But the presence, the feeling of being watched, was unmistakable now. Something or someone was here with him. And it wasn't just following him anymore. It was hunting him. Jake's pulse thudded in his ears, drowning out everything else. He could feel the weight of the camera in his hands, but it felt lighter now, almost insignificant. The whispering voice, soft but unmistakable, still echoed in his mind. It called his name like an old friend, but there was nothing friendly about it. It was hollow, cold, and distant, like a voice that had been lost to time. He had to get out. He didn't know how long he had been running, but every hallway, every corridor felt the same. The prison was endless, a maze of darkness and decay, twisting around him like it was alive. The footsteps followed him still, slow, steady, but always there. Jake stumbled, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he rounded yet another corner. The air was cold, biting, and his body ached from the tension in his muscles. His heart pounded in his chest, and he had the overwhelming sensation of being chased, of being hunted. He hadn't looked behind him for a while now. He didn't need to. He could feel it. The presence. It was close. He forced himself to keep moving, his feet dragging across the floor as if the very building was trying to hold him in place. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, reaching out from every corner, but there was no way to tell if it was his mind playing tricks on him. The silence was suffocating, and yet it was broken by that one constant sound. The footsteps. Just a little too close, a little too heavy. And then, just as he thought he might collapse from exhaustion, something changed. The air shifted, colder now, biting into his skin like ice. The walls seemed to grow taller, narrowing the path ahead. The prison was getting smaller, its once vast and open spaces closing in around him. He could feel the walls pressing in from all sides, as if the building itself was squeezing the life out of him. He had to keep moving. He had to get out. But the door, the exit he had seen before, was nowhere in sight. It was as though the prison had swallowed him whole, and no matter how hard he ran, it wouldn't let him go. He felt the weight of the camera in his hands, and for a moment he considered throwing it away. But then he remembered his audience, his subscribers, the people who had been with him for so long, following his every move. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't let this place win. He wasn't just Jake the Explorer anymore. He was Jake the Storyteller, and they needed to see the truth. He lifted the camera, aiming it down the hallway as best as he could in the dim light. His hand was trembling, and the lens wavered with each nervous breath he took. He couldn't focus on what was in front of him. He couldn't see what was coming, but the footsteps grew louder, closer now, almost at his heels. And in the back of his mind, he knew that something was waiting for him. Something that had been waiting for a long time. He was trapped. Jake turned again, the flashlight sweeping over the corridor in a desperate search for an escape. The walls were closing in even further now, the brick cracking and crumbling under the pressure. The doors, once open and inviting, were all sealed shut. The windows were nothing but shards of glass, their frames broken and useless. There was no way out. No way but forward. He had to face it. The shadows along the walls flickered, stretching and twisting unnaturally, like they had a life of their own. He could feel them, could almost see them moving, curling and reaching toward him. He swallowed hard. He wasn't sure which was worse, the feeling of being chased or the dread of knowing he couldn't outrun whatever was coming. It was inevitable now. The footsteps grew louder, louder than ever before. So close now that he could feel the vibration of each step against the cold floor beneath him. He froze. He could hear the breath, ragged and heavy, but not his own. Not his. The sound was wrong. It was too deep, too strained. It wasn't human. But then, through the darkness, a figure appeared. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall, taller than any man he had ever seen. Its silhouette was nothing but shadows, its body thin and stretched like a mannequin left out in the rain. The skin was gray, slick, and lifeless, stretching tight over bones that looked too sharp, too angular. Its face was a blur, indistinguishable, just a hollow mass of shadows and a jagged mouth that stretched unnaturally wide. Jake's legs refused to move, his body frozen in place. He couldn't look away. He couldn't breathe. He had seen things before. He had explored abandoned hospitals, rundown amusement parks, and even haunted houses, but nothing had ever prepared him for this. The creature, it wasn't just a ghost or a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was staring right at him. Its eyes, dark as the deepest night, locked onto his, and Jake felt a chill race up his spine. He opened his mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The creature took a step forward, its long, spindly arms outstretched as if it wanted to touch him. He stumbled back, tripping over his own feet, but the thing didn't move. It didn't have to. It was already in his mind. The footsteps had stopped. But now, Jake could hear something else, a whisper. "Jake?" The voice came again, and this time, it was different. It was closer. The sound wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the walls, the ceiling, the very ground beneath his feet. It surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. The prison itself seemed to be alive, suffocating him, drowning him in the whispering voice. The figure took another step, and Jake snapped out of his trance. His instincts kicked in. He turned and bolted. The camera swung wildly in his hand, but he didn't care. He had to get away. He had to survive. He ran blindly, not caring where he was going, as long as it was away from the thing that was following him. The walls blurred in his vision, the shadows crawling along the floors and ceilings like a nightmare made real. He rounded a corner, the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears, his heart thundering in his chest. But when he turned another corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. There it was. The figure was standing at the end of the hallway, its head tilted slightly to one side, like it was studying him, watching his every move. Its face remained a blur, but Jake could feel its presence in every fiber of his being. He couldn't breathe. His legs were frozen, his body locked in place, and then for the first time it spoke. "Jake, you shouldn't have come here." The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they all vibrated with the voice, as if the very prison itself was speaking to him. The thing stepped forward again, and this time it was closer. Too close. Jake couldn't take it anymore. He didn't know if he was imagining it or if it was real, but he couldn't stand still. He couldn't let it happen. His body screamed at him to run, to do anything but stay there and listen to that voice, to feel that terrible presence closing in on him. He had to get away. He had to leave, but the path behind him, the hallways he had come through, were all gone. The walls had closed in, and there was only one way left to go. Forward. With a cry, Jake took a step, and then another. His feet moved without thinking, his body a prisoner of instinct. But the figure didn't move. It stood still, its eyes locked on his every movement, every breath. Jake pushed himself forward, his pulse racing as he ran toward the only thing that might save him. The door. The exit. The light at the end of the tunnel. But as he reached for the door, his hand brushed against the cold metal handle. And then, the world went dark. All right, guys, that's where we'll leave it for today. But what do you think? What was that thing? Is Jake gonna make it out of the prison alive, or is something much darker waiting for him? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you all think happened next. And if you enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss an update on what happens next. Trust me, you won't want to miss the next chapter. Stay tuned, stay safe, and as always, explore carefully.